Katie Nelson wiped her hands on the faded apron and stepped out of the Tropicana diner, the night pressing down on her like a weight. The fluorescent sign flickered one last warning above the empty lot, and the humid air clung to her skin, heavy and sticky, as though the city itself were holding its breath. She tugged her turquoise jacket closer, a gift from her younger sister, Clara, and let her keys rattle nervously in her hand, a rhythm meant to comfort, not betray the anxiety she tried to ignore. Hours of double shifts had etched exhaustion into her muscles, yet she forced a smile, thinking of the tip jar back inside, of the bills she still had to cover, and of the fleeting freedom she would feel the moment she reached her car. The lot stretched ahead, mostly dark, dotted with failing lamps that sputtered and hummed as if they were warning signs she could not read. Every step she took seemed to echo too loudly, a percussion in the silence that made her pulse thrum like a drum in her ears. Katie's boots scraped the asphalt, her mind running through the mundane thoughts that usually brought comfort. What she would eat for breakfast, a plan to call Clara in the morning, a vague hope for tomorrow. But tonight, the normalcy fractured. A strange, uneasy quiet settled over the parking lot, an emptiness that felt alive. Her keys jingled in the only rhythm that marked her presence, a tiny heartbeat in a world that had suddenly stopped. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, if you enjoy powerful cold case stories like this, you may want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know the country you're watching from in the comments. We truly love reading them. The lot seemed larger than it should have, stretched into darkness that the failing lights couldn't penetrate. Every lamp flickered like a hesitant eye, sometimes bright, sometimes dim, leaving long, shapeless shadows that danced silently across the asphalt. Katie's jacket felt damp with sweat, her keys clutched so tightly they bit into her palm. She forced herself to keep moving, the rhythm of her steps the only proof that she was still present in a world that had suddenly grown indifferent. The hum of the city felt distant, almost as if the streets themselves were holding back, letting her feel isolated in the heart of Miami. A loose breeze stirred the discarded wrappers and bits of trash in the lot, scratching faint patterns across the pavement. Katie paused, heart racing, sensing the quiet was wrong, not the normal stillness of a late-night street, but a quiet that waited. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it, blaming exhaustion or the late hour. Her shadow stretched long and thin beside her, merging with others she could not see, and for a moment, she felt eyes on her. She quickened her pace, keys jingling faster, each ring a small anchor against the rising unease. Every corner of the lot seemed a potential hiding place, every darkened patch of asphalt a threat. Yet, the rational part of her insisted she was safe, that she had walked this path countless times. Somewhere in the distance, a streetlight buzzed and faltered, throwing the parking lot into near darkness for a split second. That brief absence of light made her stomach drop, the sudden spike of fear sharp and inescapable. Her mind raced, scanning every shadow, every silent stretch of pavement. And then, a final thought clung stubbornly, an instinct she could not ignore. Something was watching. Katie's steps faltered as she neared the far end of the lot, the dull orange glow of a broken street lamp casting shifting shapes across the asphalt. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, a tension coiling in her chest tighter with each step. Her keys, once a comfort, now rattled sharply in her trembling hand, a small warning she could not yet name. The night pressed in, thick and unyielding, a silence heavier than any sound. The distant hum of the city was gone, replaced by the faint, almost imperceptible lapping of water somewhere nearby, reminding her she was close to the bay. The air was hot, sticky, and still, carrying no reassurance, only the subtle dread that clawed at the edges of her mind. Katie paused again, glancing over her shoulder. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and yet, the hairs on her arms stood on end as though the darkness itself had teeth. She stepped forward, heart pounding, focusing on her car 50 yards away. A sudden shadow brushed past the corner of her eye, a flicker of motion too quick to identify. She blinked, and it was gone. She shook her head, scolding herself for letting fear take hold. but the chill that crawled down her spine refused to leave. Katie quickened her pace, each footfall echoing too loudly, each jangle of her keys a small alarm in the void. And then, she disappeared. Not with a scream, not with a struggle that anyone could hear. One moment she was there, stepping toward her car. The next, the lot was empty. Her keys lying on the asphalt, jingling faintly as if mocking the absence of their owner. The neon sign buzzed above. Indifferent. The silence returned. Heavier. Deeper. Swallowing the space where she had just been. The night had taken her. And in that moment, the ordinary world, Miami's late-night streets, the diner, the small routines of daily life, felt smaller, weaker, and impossibly fragile. A young woman's life vanished into the darkness, leaving only questions, grief, and a city too distracted to notice. Could something like this happen in your city? Stay with us to see how decades of silence were shattered. The sun had barely begun to rise when 3 teenagers wandered beneath the MacArthur Causeway, planning nothing more serious than skipping the first hours of school. Their laughter carried lightly across the shoreline, bouncing off the concrete pillars until it stopped all at once, cut short by a sight that froze them in place. One of them stepped forward, then staggered back as if the world had suddenly tilted. Katie's body lay just a few feet from the waterline, her turquoise jacket soaked and clinging to her. The tide pushed against her shoes in slow, steady waves, as though the sea itself was trying to return her to a world that had already failed her. Her hair was tangled, her skin pale from the chilled night air, and her limbs rested stiffly in a position no living person could hold. The boys didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stared, caught between disbelief and the rising dread that something terrible had unfolded right where they stood. One of them managed to pull out a phone, hands shaking so hard he nearly dropped it. His voice cracked as he tried to give directions to the dispatcher, each word trembling with panic. The other 2 stood guard a few feet away. As if keeping watch over a stranger, they suddenly felt responsible for a girl whose final hours had ended in violence they couldn't comprehend. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. Passing cars overhead continued without slowing, unaware that a nightmare had settled into the sand below. The boys' fear grew heavier by the second, because even from a distance, even without understanding the full truth, they knew one thing. Someone had left her here, and someone had wanted her to never be found alive. The first officer who stepped onto the shoreline stopped so abruptly that the detective behind him nearly collided with his back. The scene didn't simply disturb it, struck with the force of a physical blow. Katie's body told a story no one wanted to hear. A story written in bruises, marks, and the unmistakable signs of torment. Her wrists and ankles were lined with deep rope marks, carved so harshly into her skin that the flesh around them looked torn and inflamed. Whoever had restrained her had done so with a level of force that spoke of rage, not panic, not fear, rage. Her clothes were ripped, twisted out of shape, smeared with patches of sand, salt, and a thin, greasy sheen that clung to her like an unwanted second skin. A faint chemical odor hovered in the air, sweet, sharp, and unmistakable. Her face bore the worst of it. Her jaw hung at an unnatural angle, fractured from a blow meant to silence or punish. One eye was swollen shut. The other remained open, fixed upward at the underbelly of the old structure. That single open eye hit the detective harder than any wound. It held no life, yet it carried everything she must have felt in her last moments: shock, terror, and the desperate will to survive against someone who refused to let her. The water continued its slow rhythm, washing up just far enough to touch her shoes and retreat again, as though unsure whether to take her further into the bay or leave her where cruelty had abandoned her. By the time the medical examiner arrived, a hush had settled over the entire shoreline. No one spoke, because no one knew how to put this kind of violence into words. Detective Pierce Maxwell stepped out of his unmarked car, expecting another long, tiring morning. He was not prepared for the wait waiting for him by the shoreline. The moment he crossed under the causeway and saw the cluster of silent officers, he felt something tighten in his chest. Cases were rarely quiet. Scenes like this usually buzzed with chatter, arguments, theories. But here, Not a single voice rose above the waves. That silence was his first warning. When Maxwell first saw Katie, he froze. The world around him seemed to slow, sound thinning until all he could hear was the faint slosh of water rolling in and slipping back out. Her open eye pulled him forward, step by step, until he stood only a few feet from her. That eye wide, unmoving, locked on the concrete above hit him harder than any scene he'd witnessed in his 10 years on the force. It wasn't just fear he saw. It was a final plea. A final moment frozen in time. Her injuries told him more than words ever could. The rope marks, the fractured jaw, the bruising, the deliberate cruelty. Someone had taken their time. Someone had wanted control. Someone had wanted her suffering to speak for them. Maxwell crouched down slowly, careful not to disturb the tide line. His jaw tightened. His hands balled into fists against his knees. He had seen violence before, but this was different. This felt targeted, driven, personal. One of the younger officers shifted behind him, trying to breathe through the smell of gasoline clinging to the air. Maxwell didn't move. He stayed crouched, absorbing every detail, making a silent promise he would later repeat for decades. I won't let this become another forgotten case. Word of the discovery spread through the radios faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, more units arrived. But each officer stepped toward the shoreline with the same hesitant pace, as if the ground itself carried a warning. They weren't prepared for what they saw. Even the ones who prided themselves on keeping steady felt their breath hitch as they took in the scene. Katie's condition broke through every layer of emotional armor they had built over the years. Paramedics approached with quiet steps, their gurney unused, their hands uncertain. They could only confirm what everyone already sensed. Nothing could be done for the young woman lying near the tide. One paramedic, normally unshakable, paused for a long moment before covering her body, fighting the urge to turn away. Another officer stepped aside to compose himself, wiping at his face with the back of his sleeve. The brutality was impossible to ignore. The shoreline, usually buzzing with morning runners and fishermen, became a space of collective disbelief. Onlookers gathered at a distance, whispering, clutching phones to their chests, some frozen in place as the truth settled in. A woman on her morning walk stood completely still, her hands trembling as she tried to process what she was witnessing. A fisherman set down his bucket with a thud and whispered a short prayer under his breath. No one understood how a young woman could end up here, in this condition, abandoned in a spot people passed every single day. That realization swept through the small crowd like a cold wind. The officers didn't need to say it out loud. This was more than a crime. It was a wake-up call. If you think this could never happen in your city, the narrator's voice tightens, think again. Share this story to raise awareness. Detective Pierce Maxwell stood apart from the cluster of officers, hands shoved deep in his coat as if to hold himself together. He had seen too much to be undone by a single scene. And still, Katie's face reached into him with a force he could not ignore. He remembered, with painful clarity, the way her one open eye looked upward, not toward the sky, but toward the dark underside of the bridge. And in that stare, he felt a call he could not refuse. He walked the shoreline slowly, tracing the tide line like someone trying to read a message in scattered letters. Each small detail lodged itself into him. The greasy sheen on her clothes, the distinct rope marks on her wrists, the crushed angle of her jaw. He cataloged them silently. Not because paper could bring her back, but because notes were how he promised the living they would not be erased. The case lodged itself like a splinter in his chest, impossible to ignore, impossible to pry free. Maxwell thought of Clara's calls, the voice that never stopped asking for answers. He thought of the small routines Katie had after her shift, the turquoise jacket, the nervous clack of keys, ordinary things that now felt unbearably precious. For Maxwell, those ordinary details became a ledger of failure he intended to balance. He told himself he would not let the city's noise and distractions swallow this young woman's story. That resolve stayed with him long after the shoreline had been cleared, long after the reporters left and the tide washed the footprints away. It returned to him in the quiet hours, in the yellowed file he kept on his desk. A stubborn, living thing that would not let him forget. The moment officers arrived, the place felt completely out of control. The tide kept creeping in, pushing water over the concrete and washing away anything that might have helped. Every step taken by the responding units smeared what little evidence remained. The gasoline drifting across the surface of the water carried a sharp bite that stung the nose, creating a harsh mix of fumes and salt that made breathing difficult. Flashlights cut through the dark in frantic streaks as officers tried to make sense of what they were seeing, but nothing stayed still long enough to capture properly. Every wave erased more answers. The rising water lapped at Katie's jacket, pushing it back and forth like the shoreline was trying to take ownership of her. The ropes that scarred her wrists and ankles were already swelling, soaked from the mix of fuel and bay water. Each moment they sat exposed meant the fibers broke down even more. The officers knew it, and yet they couldn't stop it. They were racing time and losing badly. Evidence bags lay open. Latex gloves tore. A fingerprint brush slipped into the water and disappeared in seconds. No one could agree on where to start, or what to secure first. One officer tried to cordon off the area, but the tape kept sagging, pulling loose, flicking in the damp wind. Another tried to photograph the scene, but the flash reflected off the gasoline coating the water, blowing out the images. Everything their training told them to do fell apart in front of them. Detective Maxwell arrived minutes later and froze at the sight. The confusion, the rushing tide, the raw violence of what had been done to Katie, it all converged into a sinking realization. Whatever the killer had left behind was vanishing right in front of him. The case wasn't just starting on the wrong foot. It was collapsing before it even began. The hours immediately following the discovery were a blur of confusion, and every critical decision made that night seemed to pull the investigation further away from the truth. Officers moved through the scene with hurried urgency, but that urgency came at a cost. Footprints overlapped, potential evidence was shifted before it was documented, and the perimeter was widened and narrowed repeatedly as supervisors argued over protocol. What should have been a coordinated forensic effort dissolved into scattered actions led more by instinct than structure. Nothing about that night resembled the controlled, disciplined approach an investigation like this required. Detective Maxwell arrived just as the last responders were rearranging equipment near the entry path. He paused long enough to take in the disorder: open notepads, unsealed bags, and officers trading conflicting reports. To him, the scene wasn't just compromised. It felt as if the story of what happened had been rewritten several times before he even stepped forward. Standing beside him, Detective Caldwell watched the same chaos unfold, his expression tightening as he noted details being smudged or overlooked. Despite the noise, both men sensed something essential, lingering beneath the mess. A pattern, a motive, a presence that remained invisible to everyone else. Their instincts told them the case was solvable, but the system they operated within made that instinct feel like a burden. Their requests for additional forensic support were delayed. Their attempts to secure clearer documentation were brushed aside. Even the early interviews were rushed, and important witness statements were recorded in fragments, missing context that could have shaped the entire direction of the case. Within the first 24 hours, the investigation had already begun to fracture. And buried in that fracture was the earliest name to surface: Lee Jenkins, whose connection sparked more questions than answers. Comment below, what would you have done differently as a detective? As the investigation unfolded, names began to surface, but none carried the weight of certainty. Leroy Lee Jenkins was first on the list, a former dishwasher at the Tropicana Diner, notorious among the staff for inappropriate behavior and lingering too long around the waitresses. The allegation alone painted him as a plausible suspect, yet every detail of his life that night provided a solid alibi. Family members confirmed he had been more than 60 miles away in Boca Raton, celebrating his mother's birthday, and phone records, though rudimentary by modern standards, supported his story. Detectives Maxwell and Caldwell pored over every report, every line of testimony, yet each lead crumbled like sand under pressure. Other employees at the diner were questioned repeatedly, their statements shifting slightly with each retelling. creating more confusion than clarity. Witnesses claimed to see shadows, movements, figures that might have been real or imagined under the weight of fear. Each dead end was a brick added to the wall between them and the truth. The frustration of the precinct mounted. Resources were thin. The city was swamped with violent crimes. And the Nelson case, while emotionally gripping, competed with a rising tide of new cases. Every attempt to connect dots led to another closed door. Maxwell's instinct told him the answers were out there, waiting. Yet the evidence seemed to dissolve faster than they could chase it. For the young detectives and officers involved, the dissonance was crushing. The case demanded attention, demanded justice. But at every turn, the system failed to provide what was needed. The frustration lingered long after the interviews ended, leaving only more questions and the haunting certainty that the killer had slipped through their grasp. Weeks turned into months, and the momentum of the investigation began to wane. Miami in 1985 was a city overwhelmed by a wave of violent crime. Drug-related shootings, robberies, and disappearances filled the precincts and stretched officers thin. The Nelson case, shocking in its brutality, became one file among many, stacked high on desks and left to gather dust. Each day without a breakthrough felt heavier, a silent weight pressing on Maxwell and Caldwell as they watched evidence fade and memories of witnesses blur. Before we go any further, I need to confess something. My wife said there's no way this channel will hit 1,000 subscribers before Saturday. She even laughed at me. Please, don't let her be right. Hit that subscribe button, it's free, and help me walk into the living room like a champion. Detective Maxwell refused to let the case die in obscurity. He would revisit the scene alone, tracing the paths Katie might have taken, trying to reconcile the few facts with the terrifying unknowns. Caldwell, equally determined, focused on compiling the interviews and preserving every scrap of testimony that might help years later. Yet, despite their efforts, systemic shortcomings, limited technology, minimal forensic tools, and a bureaucracy too slow to respond kept the case just out of reach. The city, distracted by its own chaos, moved on quickly. Newspapers reported the discovery briefly, then turned to the next crisis. The diner reopened. The community returned to routine. And life went on as if the horror beneath the causeway had been a nightmare that belonged to someone else. For Maxwell, this indifference was infuriating. He carried the image of Katie's eyes everywhere, a silent accusation that he could not ignore. By the time the years passed, the case had officially gone cold. Files were archived, leads closed, and most of the city forgot her name. Only Maxwell kept it alive, a stubborn reminder that some stories do not end quietly, and some victims demand to be remembered. Clara Nelson never stopped calling. Every week at first, then every month, then every few months, she phoned the precinct, her voice a mix of exhaustion and defiance. She refused to accept that her sister's life had been erased, that the city could look away from the horror and simply move on. Each conversation was an appeal not just for answers, but for recognition that Katie had existed, that her laughter, her struggles, and her small acts of kindness mattered. Letters followed, handwritten, pressed with urgency, and ink-stained fingers, sent to police chiefs, detectives, and anyone who might remember. Clara's home became a shrine of photographs, mementos, and news clippings, each item a reminder of what the world had tried to forget. The pain of seeing her sister's routine so violently cut short was relentless. A daily companion she could not set aside. Her family bore the weight in their own ways. Her parents aged visibly, eyes hollow from sleepless nights and whispered what-ifs. Small celebrations became tinged with quiet sorrow, laughter fragile and easily broken by a fleeting memory of Katie. Even her younger nephews and nieces grew up hearing fragments of stories about an aunt they never met, taught early that tragedy and injustice could linger in ways the law sometimes could not resolve. Despite the exhaustion and despair, Clara pressed on. Every unanswered call, every delayed response from the precinct, fueled her determination rather than eroding it. She became both a witness and a keeper of memory, refusing to allow the city's collective forgetfulness to define the end of her sister's story. Her persistence was quiet but relentless, a beacon in a world that had tried to move forward without her. Even after retiring, Detective Pierce Maxwell could not close the file. The edges of the yellowed pages were brittle under his fingertips, yet he returned to them again and again, as though the act of reviewing could somehow mend what had been broken. Each photograph, each typed note, each fragment of testimony carried the weight of Katie's absence, pressing against him with relentless insistence. Maxwell's colleagues long ago moved on to new cases, new routines, and new lives. He could not. At night, he would sit at his desk, alone, the faint hum of the ceiling fan punctuating the silence, staring at Katie's image and replaying every step, every decision, every missed clue. It was as though the case had become an extension of himself, a shadow that would not loosen its grip. Every detail haunted him. The open eye staring upward, the rope marks, the smell of gasoline and salt. In dreams, the scene repeated with slight variations. Sometimes she would vanish before he could reach her. Sometimes he would confront the perpetrator only to find empty air. Each iteration reminded him of his limits, and yet it strengthened a quiet determination. For Maxwell, the toll was personal. The case was not just a crime. It was a reminder of the fragility of life, the brutality that could erupt unexpectedly, and the limits of human systems to protect the innocent. Every phone call from Clara, every letter, was both a burden and a lifeline, proof that Katie's story demanded attention, that the passage of decades could not silence her presence. He carried the weight of failure alongside the stubborn hope that time might eventually reveal the truth. And in that duality, Maxwell found his purpose renewed, even as the years pressed heavily upon him. The city did not wait. Miami thrummed with life, the 1,980 seconds pulse of neon, music, and endless motion washing over every street and corner. The newspapers briefly reported Katie Nelson's disappearance. Then pages turned and other headlines claimed the public's attention. Restaurants reopened, traffic flowed, and people went about their routines as though the tragedy under the MacArthur Causeway had been a fleeting shadow rather than a brutal reality. For the Nelson family, the world's indifference was deafening. Clara continued to mark the calendar, noting each anniversary, each missed call, each unanswered plea. Every holiday reminded her of a sister who would not sit at the table, laugh at shared jokes, or call to check in. Every quiet morning felt like a betrayal. How could the city forget what they could never? Maxwell understood this tension better than anyone. The contrast between collective forgetfulness and personal grief sharpened the edges of the case. While the world carried on, the pain remained fixed, unchanging, a constant reminder of injustice. Friends and neighbors tried to console the family, but words offered little comfort against the raw ache of absence. Even in public spaces, there were small echoes of remembrance. A few diners mentioned her name quietly to each other. Co-workers at the Tropicana recalled her smile, her diligence, yet those fleeting memories were fragile, easily drowned in the city's larger, more vibrant currents. The gap between the world's attention and the family's sorrow became a chasm, highlighting a truth often ignored. Tragedy does not follow a schedule, and grief does not expire when headlines fade. The persistence of memory versus the brevity of public concern painted a stark reality. One could move forward, but the other could not. For those left behind, every day was a quiet confrontation with absence, with the knowledge that some lives, though gone, demanded to be remembered. The weight of being forgotten can crush in ways that no official report or police file can measure. Clara's letters, her calls, Maxwell's silent reviews of brittle pages, they were all acts of defiance against a world that wanted to move on. Each unanswered plea, each delayed response, reinforced the sense that Katie's life had been relegated to memory alone, her story at risk of fading entirely. And yet, in that struggle, there was a quiet power. The act of remembering became resistance. Every photograph hung on the wall, every detail recounted aloud, ensured that Katie was not erased. Maxwell understood this better than most. Evidence could fade, leads could die, but memory persisted. It carried the truth forward, demanding eventual recognition and justice. In those years, the city's rhythm pressed on, indifferent, unaware of the persistent grief, tugging at the lives left behind. Friends forgot, newspapers moved to other headlines, and busy lives filled the spaces that once held attention for a brutal crime. The contrast between communal forgetfulness and the family's relentless sorrow was jarring. A constant reminder that some stories cannot be hurried, cannot be silenced by time, and for anyone who has ever felt overlooked, unheard, or dismissed, this part of the story carries a message. Your voice matters, and persistence can keep truths alive, even against overwhelming odds. If you've ever felt forgotten or overlooked, hit the like button. Your story matters. The seeds planted by Clara's tireless effort and Maxwell's unwavering attention would decades later bloom into a breakthrough that no one could have predicted. The silence of years was preparing to yield the first whispers of answers long denied. By the late 2010 seconds, forensic science had changed in ways that detectives from the 1980 seconds could only have dreamed of. Techniques once unimaginable had become practical tools, breathing new life into cold cases long thought hopeless. Touch DNA, the ability to recover genetic material from the slightest contact, allowed investigators to examine objects and surfaces that decades earlier would have offered nothing. Each fiber, each minute scrap of skin, could now tell a story that had been silent for years. Forensic genetic genealogy (FGG) added another layer of possibility. By combining DNA with publicly available family tree information, investigators could begin to trace unknown suspects through distant relatives, slowly piecing together a map of ancestry that might point directly to a culprit. It was a delicate process, one requiring patience, precision, and a deep understanding of both genetics and human connections. Detective Rochelle Vega, leading the Miami-Dade Cold Case Unit, approached the Nelson file with cautious optimism. She knew that decades of neglect had taken a toll. Evidence had been compromised, memories faded, and witnesses moved on. But the science offered hope that nothing could erase entirely. Even the tiniest fragment of preserved DNA had the potential to cut through the years and speak the truth. The promise of technology was not just theoretical, it was a lifeline. Files once abandoned in dusty evidence lockers could now be reviewed with modern techniques. Each unsolved case was a candidate for this new methodology, a chance to right what had been left unresolved for far too long. In the hands of skilled investigators, these tools were more than science. They were instruments of justice, waiting to reveal the stories that had been silenced for decades. Among the remnants of Katie Nelson's brutal struggle, a small, almost invisible trace of evidence had survived the decades. Subepidermal cells, scraped from beneath her fingernails and preserved on a sealed slide, were minute, fragile, and easily overlooked. Yet within these tiny fragments lay the last whispers of a violent encounter, a microscopic record of the person who had inflicted unimaginable pain. Dr. Hollis Jennings, the original medical examiner, had collected these samples carefully, recognizing even then that the tiniest trace could carry significance. At the time, technology could barely scratch the surface of what this material contained. 34 years later, that foresight became invaluable. Modern laboratories could now extract and amplify DNA from even the most degraded samples, opening a path that had once been entirely closed. Detective Vega and her team handled the slide with a mix of reverence and determination. Each step in the process was precise. Contamination had to be avoided at all costs. Once the subepidermal material was carefully processed, a partial Y chromosome profile emerged. The DNA was incomplete, degraded, yet unmistakably male. The profile was designated Subject Alpha, a label representing both the unknown perpetrator and the potential breakthrough that had eluded investigators for decades. This minute fragment held the key to decades of unanswered questions. Though it could not tell a complete story on its own, it offered a starting point where none had existed. Subject Alpha was a ghost lingering in the DNA, silent yet undeniable. The challenge now was to follow its thread through a labyrinth of ancestry and time, hoping that the faintest connection would lead to a name, a face, and the justice Katie Nelson had waited for so long to see. When the partial Y chromosome profile came back from the lab, the team stared at the sequence in tense silence. The data, though incomplete, represented something that had been absent for 34 years. A tangible link to the man who had taken Katie Nelson's life. He had a presence in the material world, and for the first time, science had named him not with a face, not yet, but with a profile, a pattern, a footprint in the strands of genetic code. The team immediately cross-checked the DNA with the Federal CODIS database, the repository of known offenders. Hours passed. Each search returned the same frustrating result: no match. Subject Alpha had never been caught for a crime that required a DNA sample. He had lived freely, leaving no legal trace of the horror he had committed. The tension in the room was palpable. A breakthrough had emerged, yet the path forward remained shrouded in uncertainty. Detective Vega refused to succumb to despair. CODIS was not the only avenue. Using forensic genetic genealogy, the team could now attempt to trace distant relatives of Subject Alpha, a method that had solved other decades-old cases. Slowly, painstakingly, family trees were constructed, surnames connected, patterns examined. Every branch that led to a living relative was a thread that could potentially draw the killer out of obscurity. The room held a quiet anticipation, the kind that comes when history, technology, and human determination converge. The first clue in decades had been unearthed, a whisper of truth that refused to remain buried. And as the team began the long work of tracing connections, one thing became clear. The story that had been silent for so long was finally starting to speak. Stay with us, what the DNA reveals will shock you. After months of painstaking genealogical work, the tiniest sparks of progress began to appear. Subject Alpha's partial DNA profile had led investigators to distant relatives, a third cousin living in the Pacific Northwest. It was a small thread, but in a case long starved of clues, it was enough to ignite cautious optimism. Each discovery of familial connection added another layer to the investigative map, narrowing the vast field of possibilities. Detective Vega's team worked methodically, tracing the branches of the family tree back through generations. 5 generations. Hundreds of names. Dozens of living relatives, all scrutinized for geographical relevance, age, and access to Miami in 1985. It was meticulous work, a patient hunt through the maze of kinship, each step potentially bringing them closer to the person who had remained hidden for decades. The sense of suspense in the room was electric. After so many years of silence, the DNA was speaking, and every new match carried the weight of promise. The team knew that even one small breakthrough could be the turning point. Maxwell, brought in as a consultant, felt a familiar mix of anticipation and dread. He had waited decades for an opening, and now, it seemed, the universe was offering one. For the Nelson family, though unaware of the technical intricacies, this progress represented hope. The possibility that Katie's story could finally reach its resolution became tangible, a beacon cutting through decades of anguish. Each connection, each verified lead, carried them closer to naming the man who had haunted their lives in absence. And the world was about to witness the moment when the past would no longer be silent. The first breakthrough came when Subject Alpha's partial DNA profile found a match not to a suspect, but to a distant relative. Alexis Thompson, living hundreds of miles away in the Pacific Northwest, shared enough genetic markers to confirm a common ancestor with the unknown perpetrator. It was a thread, delicate and tenuous, yet promising in a case that had long been starved of evidence. Detective Vega and her team approached this lead with a mix of excitement and caution. Alexis was unaware of her connection to a decades-old crime, and the investigation had to proceed carefully to avoid unnecessary panic. Interviews were conducted with sensitivity, tracing her lineage back several generations to identify potential male relatives who could have been in Miami in 1985. Each conversation, each record checked, slowly built a broader picture. The team cross-referenced birth certificates, marriage records, and census data, looking for men who fit the approximate age and location criteria. Every detail mattered. Dates of birth, employment history, and even small notes about travel or residence provided crucial context. This painstaking work revealed the first glimmers of clarity. While the match to Alexis was distant, it offered a direction, a path forward, where none had existed for decades. The investigation had shifted from a cold case frozen in time to a live pursuit, guided by the invisible threads of ancestry and DNA. For the detectives, it was a reminder that patience and precision could finally tip the scales. After 34 years, the path to the man responsible for Katie Nelson's death was no longer entirely obscured. Each connection brought them closer, step by step, toward a revelation long overdue. With Alexis Thompson identified as a distant relative, the team turned to building a comprehensive family tree. Each branch, each marriage, each child represented a potential connection to Subject Alpha. The process was painstaking, tracing 5 generations of lineage, confirming dates of birth, marriages, and deaths, and piecing together the intricate web of familial ties. Detective Vega oversaw the meticulous cross-referencing of records, comparing each name to known locations and timelines. Every living male relative became a point of interest, while those who had passed away were noted but temporarily set aside. The goal was to narrow the circle systematically, eliminating those who could not have been present in Miami during 1985 while focusing on those who could. The generational map quickly highlighted a pattern. A small group of men had both the age and geographical access required to be considered. Each lead was evaluated, checking employment histories, residential addresses, and any other clues that could confirm or disprove potential involvement. It was methodical work, the kind that required patience, attention to detail, and a relentless drive to connect fragmented pieces of a decades-old puzzle. For the investigative team, each node in the tree represented both possibility and tension. One name could change everything, yet they had to proceed carefully to ensure that no innocent person was implicated. With each branch mapped and each lead verified, the web of connections grew clearer, and the net began to tighten around a small number of viable suspects. The process transformed the cold case from a file of forgotten frustration into a dynamic investigation. Slowly, the years of silence were giving way to actionable leads, and the faint outlines of the man responsible for Katie Nelson's murder were beginning to take shape. As the family tree expanded, the investigators faced the grim task of eliminating those who were no longer alive. Decades had passed since 1985, and many potential suspects had died, leaving only a handful of living men who could have committed the crime. Each record of death was carefully confirmed, with obituaries, death certificates, and public records cross-checked to ensure accuracy. Detective Vega knew that every elimination brought them closer to the truth. Each name removed from the list tightened the focus, narrowing the circle until only those who were both alive and in Miami during the relevant period remained. It was a meticulous process, demanding patience and precision, but it was also a necessary step to prevent any misdirection or false accusation. The surviving candidates were few, their lives ordinary in outward appearance, yet each carried the potential to reveal the decades-old violence hidden in Miami's past. The process was a mix of relief and tension. Relief that so many could be ruled out, tension in knowing that the guilty individual could be among the remaining few. For the detectives, every exclusion was a step forward, a quiet victory in a case that had long seemed insurmountable. And for the Nelson family, still waiting, these incremental steps carried enormous emotional weight. Each name removed from suspicion brought a faint glimmer of hope that justice for Katie was not just a distant dream but a tangible possibility. The painstaking elimination of deceased individuals was more than a technical procedure, it was a decisive moment in the revival of a cold case. Slowly, the investigators were beginning to draw a circle around the man who had evaded capture for decades, preparing to finally confront the living reality of his actions. By the time the living suspects were identified, the weight of the investigation pressed heavily on everyone involved. For Detective Vega and her team, the years of careful genealogical work were more than just methodical detective work. They carried the responsibility of decades of unresolved grief. Each name remaining on the list represented a possible connection to the man who had destroyed a family's life. And the stakes could not have been higher. For Maxwell, returning to the case as a consultant, the emotional resonance was intense. He had carried Katie Nelson's memory for decades, the terror frozen in her wide, unblinking eyes, the silence of the overpass, the letters from Clara pleading for action. Now, with a small number of viable suspects identified, he felt a mixture of hope and dread. The end of the decades-long wait was within reach, but confronting the living face of evil was a sobering reality. The Nelson family, too, remained tethered to the investigation in spirit. Clara and her extended family had lived with the absence, the unanswered questions, and the gnawing uncertainty. Each step forward in the DNA analysis, each narrowed lead, carried the emotional weight of a lifetime. It was not just a search for justice. It was a reckoning, an opportunity to finally see the nightmare they had endured for so long addressed. The investigators understood the gravity of every choice, every conclusion. Each eliminated branch, each confirmed connection, brought them closer to the truth. The pressure mounted as the circle tightened, the anticipation building toward a revelation that would finally name the man responsible. Have you ever wondered if science could finally catch a killer? Comment below. The family tree was no longer just a collection of names. It was a map to justice. With the emotional and procedural groundwork laid, the next step would bring the cold case out of the shadows, ready to confront the man who had hidden in plain sight for decades. Dexter Hawthorne lived in plain sight. In 1985, he was a 32-year-old asphalt worker for a local construction firm, the same company responsible for the abandoned MacArthur Causeway project. By all appearances, he was unremarkable. A quiet man who kept to himself, tended to his modest home, and blended seamlessly into the rhythm of Miami's bustling neighborhoods. Neighbors remembered him as polite, dependable, the kind of man who quietly mowed his lawn on weekends and nodded politely at anyone he passed. His residence was only a few blocks from the Tropicana diner where Katie Nelson worked, and not far from the overpass that would later become the site of her murder. In hindsight, the proximity was chilling, but at the time, it was nothing more than coincidence, an ordinary life living side by side with the extraordinary horror it would conceal. Dexter's routine gave him a freedom no one suspected, the ability to observe, to wait, and to act without drawing attention. Even those who interacted with him regularly had no reason to be cautious. Dexter presented a face of normalcy so complete that it masked the darkness within. His job kept him busy, his hours predictable, and his social interactions minimal but cordial. No one would have guessed that the quiet man passing by on the street, the one attending neighborhood events and volunteering casually, harbored a mind capable of meticulous, premeditated violence. This ordinary exterior was a camouflage, one that allowed him to exist undisturbed for decades. It would take the sharp eyes of modern investigative work and the unyielding progress of forensic science to finally pierce through the veil of normalcy and confront the man responsible for the horror that had haunted Miami since 1985. Decades after Katie Nelson's disappearance, Maxwell returned to the case with the weariness of a man who had carried its weight for too long. The brittle files, yellowed photographs, and typed reports had long been a fixture on his desk, reminders of a tragedy he could never forget. As he carefully reviewed the original notes, one name leapt from the margins: Dexter Hawthorne. It had been dismissed in 1985, a man with an alibi, a name that had faded into the background of an overburdened investigation. The details Maxwell recalled were sparse but striking. Dexter had been noted simply as a nearby worker at the MacArthur Causeway project, living close to the Tropicana diner. At the time, investigators had taken his alibi at face value, a televised boxing match, corroborated by others, but Maxwell's instinct had always nagged at him. There was something that didn't sit right, an unease he had buried under the procedural chaos of the initial investigation. Returning as a consultant, Maxwell pored over the files, mentally reconstructing the night of the 30th of November 1985. Every overlooked detail, every discarded lead, suddenly took on a renewed significance. Dexter's proximity to both the diner and the overpass, the timing of his activities, and the pattern of his employment, all pieces of a puzzle that had been ignored for decades, now demanded attention. The contrast was stark. the ordinary life Dexter led in the neighborhood, and the extraordinary horror that had been inflicted on Katie Nelson. Maxwell felt a cold certainty growing with each review of the evidence. The answers had been in front of them all along, hidden in plain sight. And now, with modern forensic tools and a relentless pursuit of truth, the investigation could finally confront what had long been invisible. On the surface, Dexter Hawthorne was the picture of an ordinary man. He kept his lawn neat, volunteered at local church events, and never drew attention. To friends, neighbors, and casual acquaintances, he was unremarkable, blending seamlessly into the everyday rhythm of Miami life. There was nothing to hint at the depths of obsession and cruelty that had simmered beneath the calm exterior for decades. Yet behind this facade lay a calculated mind, one that had meticulously observed Katie Nelson for weeks before the attack. His proximity to the Tropicana Diner and the abandoned MacArthur Causeway gave him both opportunity and freedom to act without suspicion. The very ordinariness of his life became his shield, allowing him to move unnoticed while harboring the capacity for violence that would forever scar the city. Detectives Vega and Maxwell understood the chilling duality. Dexter's normalcy was precisely what made him dangerous. He had hidden in plain sight, a predator, camouflaged as a neighbor, a worker, a volunteer. The contrast between the life he presented to the world and the acts he committed was almost unimaginable. Yet it explained why the crime had gone unsolved for decades. The horror did not come from someone obviously menacing, but from someone whose ordinariness masked a meticulous and vengeful nature. It raises an uncomfortable question about the people around us, the facades they maintain, and the secrets they may hide. If he seemed normal, would you have suspected him? Subscribe to see the shocking truth. The stage was set. The investigation had finally identified the man who had eluded justice for over 35 years, and the next step would bring the community face to face with the horrifying reality of Dexter Hawthorne's actions. With Dexter Hawthorne now firmly in the spotlight, the investigation shifted into high gear. The narrowed suspect list, the DNA matches, and Maxwell's decades-old suspicions converged, creating a tense atmosphere in the Miami-Dade cold case unit. Every detail, every movement of Dexter's past life, was scrutinized under the unyielding lens of modern forensics. Detective Vega knew the stakes. This was no longer theory or speculation. The pieces were aligning to reveal the truth. Dexter's presence near both the Tropicana Diner and the MacArthur Causeway, the timing of his activities, and the painstakingly reconstructed family tree left little room for doubt. Every overlooked detail from 1985 now served as a thread leading directly to him. For Maxwell, the suspense was personal. 35 years of haunting images, unanswered questions, and letters from Clara culminated in this moment. He remembered Katie's terrified eyes, the silence of the overpass, and the frustration of a case that had slipped through the cracks. Now, with the net tightening, the possibility of finally confronting the man responsible loomed large. The investigators approached cautiously, aware of the delicate balance between observation and direct confrontation. The tension in the unit was palpable. Each step forward felt like peeling back layers of a decades-old wound. The anticipation of discovery, the proximity to justice after so many years, created a sense of urgency and dread that was impossible to ignore. The community, still unaware of the looming revelation, would soon confront the unimaginable truth. Dexter Hawthorne, the quiet neighbor, the ordinary man, was about to be exposed as the predator who had walked among them for decades. The suspense had reached its peak, and the next steps would bring the long-hidden darkness into the light. The breakthrough came when investigators traced Dexter Hawthorne's past residences and workplaces, focusing on locations that had remained unexamined for decades. One address, a small rented garage just a few blocks from the Tropicana Diner, stood out. It was here that the unimaginable cruelty of Katie Nelson's final hours was revealed. The garage, cluttered with paint cans, tools, and tarps, held the chilling evidence that had long been overlooked. Forensic teams carefully examined the space, noting the rope burns and restraints, remnants of a struggle that had lasted hours. Subepidermal DNA recovered from Katie's fingernails confirmed the connection between the secondary crime scene and the long cold case. Each detail reinforced the meticulous premeditation behind the assault, a grim portrait of obsession etched into the physical environment of the garage. Detective Vega and Maxwell walked through the space with solemn precision, noting how Dexter had chosen his location deliberately. Its seclusion, the proximity to his home, and the unlikelihood of casual discovery all pointed to careful planning. The scene painted a horrifying picture of calculated rage. A controlled, deliberate attack, executed with precision and terrifying patience. The evidence linked directly back to Dexter, bridging the gap between the overlooked details of 1985 and the modern investigation. The garage transformed the narrative from speculation into undeniable fact. The horror of Katie's final hours, once obscured by time and distance, was now being reconstructed piece by piece, leaving no room for doubt about the identity of the perpetrator. Every rope mark, every trace of DNA, every discarded tool became a testament to both the violence inflicted and the painstaking work required to finally illuminate the truth. For the investigators, it was a moment of grim revelation. With the secondary crime scene identified, investigators began piecing together the final hours of Katie Nelson's life. Using Dexter Hawthorne's proximity to both the Tropicana diner and the garage, along with witness statements and historical records, they constructed a timeline that revealed a terrifying sequence of events. Every hour, every movement, now carried renewed significance. Katie had clocked out at 2:15 a.m., stepping into the quiet Miami night with her turquoise jacket shielding her from the chill. The time between leaving the diner and the discovery of her body was long, and for decades, it had been a haunting void in the investigation. Now, it became clear that Dexter had used this window to execute a premeditated plan, selecting the garage as a controlled environment to carry out the assault. The evidence indicated she was restrained, subjected to a prolonged struggle, and left with rope marks on her wrists and ankles. Forensic analysis confirmed subepidermal DNA under her fingernails, a desperate attempt to fight back captured in microscopic traces. Every detail fit into a chilling puzzle, revealing both Dexter's obsessive planning and the vulnerability of a young woman caught in his path. Detectives Vega and Maxwell reconstructed the sequence meticulously, noting the deliberate timing, the movement between locations, and the calculated risk he had taken. The timeline transformed the narrative from abstract fear to concrete horror, showing not only the brutality but the careful orchestration of the attack. As the investigation deepened, the terrifying extent of Dexter Hawthorne's obsession became clear. He had watched Katie for weeks, noting her routines, her roots, even the subtle ways she interacted with the world. What had seemed like random tragedy in 1985 now revealed itself as a carefully orchestrated act, executed with calculated precision and a disturbing fixation. Detectives Vega and Maxwell pieced together the behavioral patterns that explained his choice of locations, timing, and methods. The garage was not random. It offered him control, a secluded space where he could assert dominance without risk of interruption. Every rope, every restraint, every movement was part of a premeditated plan, a controlled sequence driven by a dangerous obsession born from rejection and simmering resentment. The psychological portrait was chilling. Dexter's motivations were rooted in a desire for power over Katie, a need to correct, in his mind, a perceived slight. The mundane incident of her refusing his earlier assistance had become the seed of a vendetta that would culminate in a night of unspeakable violence. The ordinary man he presented to the world masked a meticulous, vengeful mind capable of prolonged cruelty. With every detail from the secondary crime scene, every rope mark, and each trace of DNA analyzed, the case against Dexter Hawthorne began to crystallize. The connection between the garage, the Tropicana diner, and the overpass was undeniable. Forensic evidence confirmed what investigators had long suspected. The attack was deliberate, the locations chosen, and the timeline consistent with premeditation. Detective Vega reviewed the subepidermal DNA recovered from Katie's fingernails, alongside the partial Y chromosome profile. The match to Dexter's family tree left no ambiguity. Rope burns and restraint marks corroborated his presence at the secondary crime scene. Every piece of physical evidence, when viewed collectively, formed an inescapable portrait of responsibility. Maxwell, who had carried the weight of the case for decades, felt a mix of relief and renewed horror. The terror captured in Katie's eyes so many years ago was now tied to a man who had lived among the community unnoticed. For the first time, the investigators could tell the story with clarity, connecting each horrific detail into a cohesive, undeniable truth. The evidence, once scattered and incomplete, now converged, leaving no room for doubt. Dexter Hawthorne, the quiet neighbor, was exposed as the orchestrator of Katie Nelson's death. The long shadow of mystery was broken, replaced by clarity and confrontation. The stage was set for the final act: arrest, confession, and the reckoning that would follow decades of silence. The morning air was crisp as Detective Vega and Maxwell drove toward Dexter Hawthorne's modest ranch home in Kendall. The quiet neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and unassuming houses, seemed an unlikely backdrop for the confrontation about to unfold. Every step of the approach was calculated, every detail observed. The weight of decades-long investigation pressed down on the team, but there was no room for hesitation. Hawthorne's home appeared ordinary, blending seamlessly into the suburban streets around it. No sign hinted at the darkness that had unfolded within his past. The investigators paused momentarily, acknowledging the tension between what the neighborhood projected and the truth they were about to uncover. Each step closer intensified the emotional gravity of the moment. Inside the car, Maxwell's mind flickered back over the decades of unanswered questions, reports, and photographs. He recalled Katie's wide, terrified eyes and the silent accusation they had carried for 35 years. This moment, standing outside Dexter's door, was the culmination of decades of persistence, frustration, and grief. The team prepared to execute the arrest warrant, carefully considering the safest and most effective approach. Every action was deliberate, every movement measured. The weight of justice was palpable, yet tempered by the understanding that decades of human life, both the victims and the suspects, hung in balance. The quiet of the neighborhood contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions running through the investigators. This was the moment where history, science, and relentless determination converged. Dexter Hawthorne, a man who had moved through life unnoticed for decades, was about to confront the consequences of his actions. The tension was almost unbearable, the anticipation electric. Detective Vega rang the doorbell, the sound echoing faintly through the quiet street. Inside, Dexter Hawthorne appeared calm, almost ordinary, as if decades of hidden crimes had left no trace on his demeanor. His eyes flicked toward the officers, revealing the first hints of recognition, a subtle shift that betrayed the tension lurking beneath his composed exterior. Maxwell and Vega's presence brought decades of unresolved trauma to the surface. Every step of the encounter was laden with history, the forgotten hours, the lost evidence, and the relentless passage of time that had finally brought them here. Hawthorne stood at the threshold, his movements deliberate, yet subdued. There was no outburst, no struggle, only the weight of truth pressing down on him. As Vega read the warrant, Hawthorne's posture faltered slightly, a fleeting acknowledgement that his past could no longer hide behind routine life. The officers noted every expression, every tremor, each subtle reaction revealing a man finally confronted by the consequences of his actions. Maxwell's heart pounded, memories of Katie's eyes and the overpass scene, mixing with the adrenaline of the present moment. The quiet suburban setting belied the gravity of the arrest. A man who had lived unnoticed for decades was now the center of an investigation that had spanned generations. The tension was thick, each second stretched by anticipation, as Maxwell and Vega observed the transformation of Hawthorne from an ordinary neighbor into the embodiment of decades-old horror. With Dexter Hawthorne in custody, the atmosphere shifted from tension to grim resolution. Officers secured the premises, carefully cataloging evidence that had long been overlooked. Each item, tools, ropes, and personal belongings now held context and meaning, connecting the quiet suburban home to the brutal events of 35 years earlier. Hawthorne's demeanor remained unsettlingly composed. There was no outburst, no attempt to evade responsibility. Instead, he seemed to shrink under the weight of the decades he had carried his secret. An ordinary man confronting extraordinary accountability. Maxwell and Vega observed quietly, noting the subtle signs of internal reckoning. A hand trembling slightly, eyes avoiding contact, the fleeting pause of breath that betrayed the emotional gravity of the moment. The arrest resonated far beyond the walls of the home. Neighbors, unaware of the darkness that had walked among them, now faced a community-wide shock. How could a man so unremarkable harbor such malice? For investigators, the arrest triggered a cascade of emotions. Relief mingled with the resurgence of old trauma. Maxwell, who had carried the image of Katie's wide, terrified eyes for decades, felt a strange combination of vindication and sorrow. Vega documented every detail, aware that the painstaking evidence collected over years had finally converged. Justice may take decades, but it is attainable. The arrest honors the persistence of investigators and the memory of the forgotten. Share this story, the narrative urges, to honor those whose voices have been silenced too long. The convergence of patience, science, and determination finally produced results, a testimony to the power of relentless pursuit. The weight of decades lifted slightly as Maxwell watched the scene unfold. 35 years of unanswered questions, of haunting memories and silent grief, had culminated in this moment. Katie Nelson's death, which had lingered as an unresolved shadow, now had a name attached, a face, a confession, a reckoning. Clara Nelson, now a grandmother, received the news with a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. Years of unanswered calls to the precinct, of relentless hope and quiet suffering, had led to this moment. When she learned that Dexter Hawthorne, the man who had lived among them unnoticed, had been arrested, tears flowed freely. They were not tears of joy, but the release of a lifetime of suppressed anguish, anger, and frustration. Detective Vega observed Maxwell's reactions, noting how the case had carved deep lines into the lives of all involved. For him, the arrest was both relief and confrontation with the human cost of unresolved crimes. Memories of Katie's wide, terrified eyes resurfaced, a stark reminder of the victim behind every file, every piece of evidence, and every painstaking hour of investigation. The community, too, faced the shock. The realization that a seemingly ordinary man had carried out such horrific acts stirred both fear and reflection. The arrest became a catalyst for dialogue, a moment to acknowledge past failures and the relentless pursuit of justice. Dexter Hawthorne sat across from Detective Vega, the fluorescent light above casting a sharp glare on the table. He appeared calm, almost disarmingly ordinary, as if decades of hidden guilt had left no mark on his composed exterior. Yet beneath that calm was a subtle tension, a barely perceptible tightening in his jaw and a flicker in his eyes. The officers could feel it, the first stirrings of a man confronting the weight of his past. Vega began the questioning with deliberate precision, each word measured to elicit truth without provoking resistance. Maxwell observed quietly, the memory of Katie's terrified gaze pressing against him like a phantom. Years of unresolved questions and painstaking investigation converged in this single room, where silence carried the heaviest meaning. Hawthorne answered, initially in clipped sentences, avoiding self-incrimination, projecting a facade of ordinariness. Yet with each careful question, Vega noticed the cracks. He hesitated, blinked, and occasionally paused, as if grappling internally with decades of secrecy. Maxwell's instincts told him the confession was near. The pattern of speech, the small involuntary gestures, they all hinted at the long-suppressed truth itching to escape. The room was charged with anticipation. Each moment stretched, tension coiling tightly around the officers and the suspect alike. The ordinary man seated before them was about to reveal the extraordinary darkness he had hidden for over 3 decades. The first words of admission, small and deliberate, would soon open a window into a calculated obsession that had culminated in the most harrowing of crimes. Hawthorne's voice was steady, almost rehearsed at first, as he began recounting the weeks leading up to the night of Katie's disappearance. He described watching her routine, noting the hours she arrived and left the Tropicana diner, the streets she walked, the small patterns in her life that only a meticulous observer could track. Each detail, mundane to anyone else, had become an anchor for his obsession. Detective Vega listened, recording every word, every nuance of emotion that slipped through Hawthorne's measured tone. Maxwell, watching, felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Decades of unanswered questions were finally aligning with a horrifying clarity. The ordinary life Hawthorne had lived, the neighborly smiles and church volunteer appearances, now clashed violently with the predator he revealed himself to be. As Hawthorne spoke, he detailed how the obsession grew in intensity. Every polite dismissal from Katie, every small act of independence she displayed, became fuel for his simmering rage. He followed her movements, not out of curiosity, but compulsion. The officers felt the rising tension in the room as the layers of his fixation were peeled back. Evil can hide in plain sight, masked by ordinary routines. Vega paused occasionally, allowing the weight of his words to sink in, each revelation building anticipation for the next. The story of stalking was not just about physical observation, but the psychological control he sought to impose. A chilling prelude to the night that would forever mark Katie's life. Comment what you think drove him to this revenge or obsession? Hawthorne's voice grew quieter, deliberate, as he described the moment he cornered Katie in the cramped garage he had rented just blocks from the Tropicana diner. The room had been silent, filled only with the hum of fluorescent bulbs and the faint scent of oil and paint. He recounted the careful measures he had taken to restrain her, how he had brought rope to ensure she could not escape. Every movement calculated and controlled. Detective Vega felt the tension in the room tighten, each detail of the assault more harrowing than the last. Maxwell's memory flashed back to the overpass scene, to Katie's wide, terrified eyes staring upward, and a familiar ache of helplessness surged. The garage, once ordinary and overlooked, was now revealed as a chamber of cruelty where the violence had been executed with chilling deliberation. Hawthorne spoke of the hours Katie endured, the struggle, the rope burns, and the terror in her voice. He described how the gasoline had been prepared, intended to destroy evidence, yet inadvertently preserve the traces that would eventually link him to the crime. Comment what you think drove him to this revenge or obsession? Hawthorne's explanation of his motive revealed a mind consumed by resentment and obsession. He recounted, almost clinically, how a seemingly trivial interaction months earlier, Katie refusing his offer to help change a flat tire, had lodged itself in his consciousness, festering into a compulsion to dominate and punish. The ordinary rejection, insignificant to anyone else, had become the seed of a violent obsession, driving him to meticulously plan the attack that would shatter Katie's life. Detective Vega and Maxwell listened intently, the room heavy with the gravity of decades-old horror finally articulated. Hawthorne's calm, matter-of-fact tone clashed violently with the cruelty of his actions. The psychological portrait that emerged was chilling. A man who masked a monstrous fixation with decades of ordinary life, who nurtured resentment in silence until it erupted in calculated violence. How easily can obsession hide behind a facade of routine? Comment what you think drove him to this revenge or obsession. Hawthorne's confession reached its final layers, revealing the deliberate care he had taken to erase evidence while exposing the full horror of his crime. He recounted pouring the remaining gasoline over Katie's body at the MacArthur Causeway, not merely as an act of concealment, but as a final assertion of control over the scene. Every step, every decision, was now laid bare, exposing the terrifying precision behind decades of hidden guilt. Detective Vega documented each detail, understanding how the evidence finally aligned with the decades-old forensic clues. Maxwell, standing silently, felt the culmination of years of frustration, grief, and unanswered questions settle into a heavy, almost tangible relief. The confession transformed years of unresolved trauma into a narrative with clarity, giving voice to Katie's stolen life. a reminder of the fragility of life, the persistence of memory, and the enduring impact of human cruelty. The story, once a collection of unanswered questions and haunting images, now has closure, though the emotional scars remain. The morning of the trial was crisp, the Miami sun cutting through the tension like a blade. Dexter Hawthorne entered the courtroom, his movements measured, almost indifferent. Yet there was a quiet weight in the room that seemed to follow him. The regular hum of the court felt distant, overshadowed by the decades of unanswered questions, the lives altered, and the grief that had lingered in the shadows for over 35 years. Detective Vega and Maxwell took their seats, each carrying the burden of memories and the satisfaction of finally seeing justice inch closer. The courtroom was a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. Family members, community witnesses, and journalists filled the room, all waiting to witness the culmination of a story that had remained unresolved for generations. Every glance, every shuffle of paper, every quiet murmur added to the charged atmosphere. Hawthorne's attorney approached the bench, the first procedural steps moving slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of time itself had seeped into the pace of the proceedings. The judge called the court to order, and in that moment, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. All eyes, whether filled with anger, grief, or curiosity, were fixed on the man whose ordinary life had masked extraordinary evil. The courtroom grew still as the prosecution began presenting the evidence that had finally linked Dexter Hawthorne to Katie Nelson's murder. The DNA samples, preserved for decades, were displayed in clear, undeniable detail. Every trace collected from under Katie's fingernails, every degraded fragment that had once seemed hopeless, now told a story of truth that could no longer be denied. The partial Y chromosome, the forensic genealogy, the painstaking reconstruction of Hawthorne's family connections, everything converged to paint an unshakable picture. Then came the confession. The courtroom hung on every word, as Hawthorne admitted the weeks of surveillance, the obsessive tracking of Katie's routines, and the calculated steps he had taken in the garage and at the overpass. Vega's voice calmly guided the narrative, while Maxwell's eyes never left the suspect, measuring the weight of decades of secrecy finally revealed. The contrast between Hawthorne's ordinary demeanor and the horrifying reality of his actions was chilling. Subscribe to follow more cases where justice arrives decades late. As the details of the evidence and confession sank in, the courtroom became a theater of raw, unfiltered emotion. Clara, Katie's sister, struggled to remain composed. Years of grief, frustration, and unanswered questions surfaced in heavy sobs that shook her frame. Her hands clutched at tissues, trembling, yet her gaze remained fixed on Hawthorne, as if measuring the man who had stolen so much from her life. Each revelation reopened wounds that had never fully healed, yet now brought the faintest glimmer of justice to light. Detective Maxwell, sitting nearby, felt decades of tension and regret lift slightly, replaced by a heavy wave of solemn relief. The memory of Katie's wide, terrified eyes at the overpass, etched into his mind for decades, seemed to finally have a voice, a resolution. The emotional burden that had shadowed him through countless other cases found a measure of release as Hawthorne's actions were fully exposed and publicly acknowledged. Around the courtroom, community members and witnesses experienced a mix of shock, disbelief, and empathy. Many who had followed the case for years now felt the weight of truth settling, the invisible threads of fear and sorrow finally visible and named. The story is a reminder that persistence, vigilance, and faith in the pursuit of justice can restore a measure of hope, even decades later. Every viewer is invited to internalize the emotional impact, recognizing that behind every case are human lives shaped forever by tragedy, yet strengthened by truth and accountability. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom, firm and unyielding, as the verdict was read. Dexter Hawthorne was found guilty on all counts. The room seemed to inhale collectively, a moment suspended in time as decades of pain, uncertainty, and fear finally reached their apex. For the Nelson family, justice had arrived, not in hours or days, but in decades, carrying with it both relief and the heavy weight of memories that could never be erased. Sentencing followed swiftly. Hawthorne was given life imprisonment, the severity of the punishment, a mirror to the cruelty and premeditation of his acts. The judge's words resonated beyond the walls of the courtroom, a declaration that the passage of time could not shield a man from accountability. For Maxwell, the moment was a quiet vindication, a resolution to a career-long shadow that had lingered over his conscience since that first night beneath the overpass. Clara wept openly, a torrent of exhaustion, grief, and disbelief spilling forth. Her tears were not those of joy but of released decades of carrying Katie's absence, now mingled with the knowledge that her sister's killer could never harm another. Community members, once numb to the unresolved case, now witnessed a moral reckoning, a reminder that even the longest silence can be broken by truth. Subscribe to follow more cases where justice arrives decades late. Detective Pierce Maxwell sat quietly in his study. The old case files of Katie Nelson spread before him like fragile remnants of a life interrupted. The yellowed photographs, the brittle pages of reports, and the haunting images of her wide, terrified eyes had followed him for decades. Each time he revisited the case, a knot of frustration and sorrow tightened in his chest, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been left unresolved for so long. Now, decades later, the arrest, confession, and conviction offered a measure of relief Maxwell had never fully imagined. The haunting gaze of Katie, once an image of silent accusation, had finally found a voice through the unyielding work of modern forensic science and the patience of investigators who refused to give up. Maxwell reflected on the long journey from the flawed investigation in 1985 to the years of silence, to the painstaking reconstruction of evidence that ultimately revealed the truth. For him, the case was more than a crime solved. It was a testament to persistence, intuition, and the human capacity to confront and overcome evil. The psychological weight of unresolved cases had marked his career. Yet this victory, however delayed, reminded him why he had chosen law enforcement, to seek justice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. In the quiet of his study, Maxwell allowed himself a long, deep breath. The terror in Katie's eyes no longer haunted him. It had been transformed into clarity, into justice served after decades of waiting. The case of Katie Nelson became more than a single tragedy. It became a testament to what unwavering persistence and scientific innovation could achieve. For decades, the murder had sat in obscurity, a silent wound in the city's memory. The limitations of 1,985 investigations had left a family in anguish and a detective haunted by unanswered questions. Yet, the advances in forensic science, particularly touched DNA and genetic genealogy, finally allowed truth to emerge from the shadows. Detective Vega's work in meticulously reconstructing the genetic links, tracing distant relatives, and narrowing suspects demonstrated that patience and methodical investigation could pierce even the thickest veil of time. Every tiny fragment of evidence, once deemed useless, gained profound significance. The techniques applied in Katie's case not only solved her murder but also signaled a new era of accountability, where crimes once considered permanent mysteries could be unraveled, one trace at a time. Beyond the science, the story underscored the importance of societal vigilance. Justice is not only about evidence. It requires a community unwilling to forget, a family unwilling to relinquish hope, and investigators who refuse to abandon the pursuit of truth. The collaboration between past and present, old instincts and modern tools, highlighted that perseverance could restore dignity to victims and provide closure to those left behind. Katie Nelson's case, resolved decades later, left an enduring legacy: the power of persistence, the promise of science, and the unwavering human drive to correct wrongs. It proved that even when time stretches long and injustice seems permanent, resolution is possible. Clara Nelson stood silently outside the courtroom after the verdict, her hands trembling and her breath uneven. Decades of grief, worry, and sleepless nights weighed on her like stones. Yet now, there was a sliver of release. She remembered the countless times she had called the precinct, pleading for updates, insisting that Katie's case remained alive. That relentless hope had carried her through years of silence and frustration. The arrest and conviction of Dexter Hawthorne did not erase the pain, nor did it bring Katie back. Yet, it gave Clara a form of recognition that had been absent for far too long. The justice delivered, no matter how delayed, validated every tear shed, every memory recalled, and every sleepless night haunted by questions without answers. It was a reckoning, a confirmation that her sister's life, though brutally cut short, had not been forgotten. Family members, now spanning generations who had grown up with Katie's absence as an unspoken shadow, gathered quietly, feeling a mix of sorrow and relief. The story that had haunted their lives for 35 years had reached its conclusion. Though grief would remain, it was now tempered by the knowledge that the person responsible had been identified, confronted, and held accountable. For Clara, closure was not a single moment but a gradual settling of long-held pain. The silence that had dominated their lives was broken by truth, and with it came a fragile peace, the weight of decades lifted just enough to allow remembrance, without endless torment, a chance to honor Katie's life, while acknowledging the persistence and courage that had brought justice at last. The story of Katie Nelson's murder, its decades-long obscurity, and the eventual capture of Dexter Hawthorne left a mark far beyond the courtroom walls. It became a testament to human perseverance, the unwavering dedication of investigators, and the quiet but powerful impact of modern forensic science. Years of silence had not erased her memory. Instead, they strengthened the resolve of those who refused to let the case fade into oblivion. Detective Maxwell, retired yet present in spirit throughout the final proceedings, reflected on the lessons embedded in the tragedy, the importance of persistence, the patience to allow science and time to reveal truth, and the courage to confront uncomfortable realities were clear. This case demonstrated that even when justice seems delayed, it is never truly out of reach. The meticulous work of investigators, coupled with advances in forensic technology, created a bridge across decades of uncertainty, connecting the pain of the past with resolution in the present. For Clara and her family, the legacy was deeply personal. Katie's life, once violently taken and nearly erased, had finally been acknowledged and honored. Their decades of grief had transformed into a measured peace, a recognition that the world could still correct wrongs, even after years of waiting. The silence of the MacArthur Causeway, once a symbol of loss, was replaced with a resonance of accountability, justice, and remembrance. If this story moved you, comment, "Justice served," and share to honor Katie's memory. Let it serve as a reminder that perseverance matters, that victims are never truly forgotten, and that truth can reach across decades to bring closure. The case of Katie Nelson stands as both a warning and an inspiration, a story of tragedy, courage, and the enduring power of justice.